Okay, great. Hello, everyone. This meeting of the Board of Chiropractic Examiners is being held by teleconference under Government Code Section 11133 and Executive Order N122. Today's date is March 22nd, 2022, and the time is 12:01 p.m. To the members of the public that are listening and would like to provide public comment by telephone, will be limited to 3 minutes unless in the discretion of the board circumstances require a longer period. Members of the public will not be permitted to yield their allotted time to other members of the public to make comments. The board's paramount responsibility is to protect the health, welfare, and safety of the public through licensure, education, and enforcement in chiropractic care. Please be aware that this meeting is being audio recorded. Please turn off or silence all cell phones. And we will now take roll call of the board. Mr. Sweet, would you please call the roll?
Yes. David Paris.
Present.
Lawrence Adams.
Present.
Raphael Sweet is present. Janet Cruz.
Present.
Pamela Daniels is absent, I believe. Dion McLean.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Sweet. So moving on to our agenda, item number 2. Today's call is to update on the board's March 7th, 2022 Joint Sunset Review Oversight Hearing and review, discussion, and possible action on board's response to issues identified in the Sunset Review background paper and during the hearing. And seeing as this is a kind of a different format than the board calls we're used to, I'd like to just open to give a brief update on the hearing and the process as we approached it, and then I'll let Ms. Walker add in. And then our plan was to go through the issues and have a discussion there of our response to each issue, our kind of a broad strokes at our response, so that staff can take this back and work to come up with language. And then we'll be seeking a motion to have 2 board members who can work with staff to kind of come up with our final language. So in prep, we did a detailed review of the background paper, and we anticipated questions and discussion responses. We realized there were going to be nuances to a virtual hearing versus live. And so we split the issues into external professional issues for myself to respond to, and board operations, Ms. Walker responded to, and then we developed potential responses from there. We held a mock hearing with DCA leadership on Friday, March 4th, and the hearing was on Monday, March 7th. Overall, we believe the hearing went very well, and our feedback to date has been supportive of that and very positive. We did receive some questions from the committees, and that's what we're here today to do, is to discuss our prepared responses and if needed, give the staff some direction, and then again, hopefully get a motion to identify 2 board members, get stakeholder feedback. And I just want to remind everybody, in the interest of time, the further kind of deeper discussion of the issues themselves can be brought up at a committee meeting to a full board agenda or via the strategic plan process. Ms. Walker, anything to add?
Thank you. Dr. Paris summed it up very well as far as what staff had called this meeting before the board, so that some of the issues identified in the background paper are policy issues. So we want to have the board discuss it at this meeting, and then the takeaway from the meeting is what we're seeking is a motion to appoint 2 board members to review and approve the final response as prepared by staff.
So are there any initial questions from anyone on the board about the process and how we're going to try and do today's meeting? Ms. Cruz?
Let's see. Yes, question. In understanding that we don't want to get too far into detail and that we want to make sure we, what's it called, at the same time give guidance as needed right now, is it possible where kind of as we go through discussion, if we find ourselves going too down the road, kind of trust that you would be able to kind of just kind of raise your hand and let us know that we've gone too far. I think just in my notes, I want to make sure that I kind of take the time under consideration and make sure I participate accordingly in the next couple months.
Yeah, I think so. And I think staff can help us kind of keep us focused. There's about 12, 13 issues effectually. Yeah, exactly. And so it's going to be a lot to run through. And then also some of the specific questions that were directed to us during the sunset hearing. So we also want to have some potential discussion of those if needed. I think some of these will move very quickly though. So is there any other questions about process? Okay. So for the benefit of the public who may be on the call and anyone listening in who doesn't have the background paper in front of them, I'll just go through and like I said, Ms. Walker and I had split up the issues into kind of more external profession related issues and then kind of board operations. And so with kind of how we did that, I'll just start out with number one and then Ms. Walker, you can just pick up or how we split them up previously. Issue number one regarding board composition, the issue was, does BCE's composition need to be updated to include additional members of the public or non-chiropractic medical professionals? And in our response, the first thing we noted was that the board has not discussed this issue and does not yet have an official position. We would like to take the opportunity in our response to note that the current composition of the board has not compromised consumer protection, as all board members are appointed by the governor, held accountable by the administration, and conduct their business transparently through public meetings, consistent with the board's mission to protect and serve the public, not the profession. And we also felt like this would be something where we could note that we would like to, this can be discussed further at our strategic planning meeting. Ms. Walker, anything to add there?
No, just other than this is a policy issue, so whether the board wants to discuss it at this meeting and start framing an answer, or if it wants to be deferred to strategic planning, that's really the direction that staff needs in order to draft the response.
Any comments from the board members on that issue? Yes, Ms. Cruz?
I feel like it requires a lot more information in terms of allow for discussion. Not sure if there's opportunity for recommendation here, but to kind of defer to the strategic planning.
Thank you. Anyone else? And may I just ask a point of clarification from Mr. Hurtado? Is it okay if we run through this agenda item and all the issues contained in the agenda item and then go to public comment at the end versus, or should we go to public comment after each and every issue?
I think it's certainly permissible to ask for public comment at the conclusion of all the questions or issues that need to be discussed by the board.
Okay, thank you. Any further comment from the board members? Okay, I think we can move to issue number 2.
Thank you. Issue number 2 relates to regulations, and the specific question is, what is the current timeframe for BCE regulatory packages to be approved and finalized? And they're seeking information about an update on the board's pending regulations and current timeframes. As far as an average, we're right about a year and a half from initial package submission for departmental approval through the effective date of our regulations. We are pleased to report that the DCA's new regulatory unit within the Office of Legal Affairs has drastically reduced the timeframes for reviewing our regulatory packages. The issue that does remain before the board is the regulatory workload that remains in the concept development stage prior to that formal submission for review by the department. Currently, we have just one staff position that's dedicated to working on the regulatory and policy work for the board, as well as a number of other types of projects. And as part of kind of a broader effort from staff to make our internal operations more efficient, we're working closely with the Office of Human Resources on a reorganization plan so that we can dedicate an additional staff person to our regulatory and policy workload. And then also to expeditiously move some of our regulatory proposals forward, the board recently has been dividing some of the larger proposals that are pending into smaller pieces so that the non-controversial portions of our regulations can move forward while some of the other concepts are still being developed. So with that, it really is a focus in these upcoming years on the board is to clear kind of the regulations backlog that's in effect. And those are the efforts that we're making to combat that. Are there any questions from the board members as it relates to our regulations?
I have a question. Good morning. You mentioned that reorganization of staff is one thing that you're working on with HR. Given that in part of our challenge here is staff and staffing issues, will that take away from something else? How are you structuring that so that that doesn't occur, because we're already short-staffed and having issues with recruitment?
So what we're as part of the broad, as part of the broad reorganization, what we're looking to do is to establish distinct units. So right now, our administration unit is combined with licensing and CE, and we're looking to separate that into specific units and then redivide the work. We're also going to have some efficiencies gained through our new IT system, and through that, we're going to more clearly delineate the work between licensing and admin so that we can free up additional staff that can work on the admin work with regulations and policy items. So it's more of leveraging the technology that we have and putting a reorganization in place so that everyone's very clear on their duties and that they're not spilling over between the units. And then once we get that organization down, we're going to be working with the department on a pretty robust recruitment effort so that we can get these positions filled.
And so what is the, just to follow up, what are the efficiencies that you anticipate through the new IT system, and will you be putting that in to the answer as well?
As far as the efficiencies gained, it has to do with the online renewals, the online initial license applications, and then eventually we're going to be developing the CE process to move away from so much paper and getting that onto the platform. Those efficiencies aren't specifically going to be outlined in response to this question. It's more going to be focused on the goal of the reorganization to get additional staff for completing the regulatory work.
And just as a sidebar, well, not sidebar, but I know this is probably more so along the lines of when we get to the budget question, but just to put it out there for you to remind us when we get to the budget question, what will those, have we looked at, or are we looking at how the efficiencies can be monetized as far as, say, cost savings? So that's probably more of a budget, but it ties in here when you talk about efficient making, the IT system and efficiencies and staffing. So if you can address that when we get to the budget part, that would be very helpful.
Certainly. Thank you. Are there any other questions on regulations from the board members?
Not hearing or seeing any hands up. Let me move to issue number 3, strategic plan. The issue questions were, what is the status of the BCE strategic plan? In addition, what will be the priorities for upcoming strategic planning sessions? And in our prepared kind of talking points, we noted that that we did have to postpone the development of our strategic plan due to board member vacancies and COVID-19 back in 2020. Now the board is almost fully appointed, and we've been working with Solid Planning Solutions to resume strategic planning facilitation services. We noted that the focus of our strategic planning session will be on the trends identified through the environmental scan, which I think most or all of us have had those initial interviews with Solid, and the sunset review process and the development of objectives for plan in the areas of licensing and professional qualifications, enforcement, public relations and outreach, laws and regulations, and organizational development. And in our response, we considered that we would update on the status of the Solid interviews and the scheduled calendar of our future meetings, and that our plan is to have an updated strategic plan presented to the board at the October meeting. We felt like we could develop specific objectives at strategic planning. And I think those were most of the points that we were going to include in our written response so far. So if there's any discussion or questions from the board members or anything additional from Ms. Walker. Okay. Hearing none and seeing no hands raised here. Ms. Walker, issue 4.
Okay, thank you. Issue 4 concerns the board's fund condition and fees. The question is that BCE states the need for a statutory fee increase based on the result of a recent fee audit. Does the board anticipate the need to further increase fees proposed by the fee study, and what is causing the need for multiple fee increases over such a short period of time? So as far as this is one of probably the more major issues that is going to need some board discussion at today's meeting. As far as in response to the issue of why they're occurring so frequently, the prior fee study that was conducted a few years ago didn't account for the costs associated with the board's business modernization IT project, nor did it account for repayment of the loan that we owe to the Bureau of Automotive Repair. And there was no way to anticipate the substantial rate increase for legal services provided to the board by the Attorney General's office. So those 3 factors together is kind of what led us to be where we are now. The current fee study that was prepared by Matrix Consulting Group takes those factors into account with a future growth factor to rebuild 6 months of reserves within 5 years. It was a point-in-time study, so it didn't account for our anticipated need to increase our allocation to the DCA Division of Investigation for additional sexual misconduct complaints and fraud cases. And we're also monitoring some current legislation that's been proposed that would reduce the inactive license fee to half of that for an active license. So both of those factors, just depending on how they work out, may cause a need to adjust the numbers. But other than that, the board has been working the board staff has been working very closely with the department's budget office to finalize a proposal with the sole purpose of preventing such frequent requests by planning for our future needs. And the board does take pride in using its resources responsibly. We've done our best to control costs. We've delayed the purchase of new IT equipment, and we rely on equipment that's actually loaned to us from the department. We also, we utilize vehicles that are quite old, and anything that we can to achieve cost savings. And then with the development of our IT project, we are looking at how to make things as efficient, not only for the licensees and applicants completing the applications, but then the amount of staff time on the backside of reviewing and approving applications and moving them through the process. So really through those efficiencies, as well as reduced travel costs and the savings we've found from utilizing platforms such as this to conduct video conference meetings and interviews, we think that the fees that are proposed by Matrix Consulting Group are appropriate to get the board on a more sound fiscal situation. And really the purpose behind that proposal is to realign the fees with the actual costs of providing the services. Because as noted in the report, the annual renewal fees would just slightly increase by about $23. The initial license fees would actually decrease by $75. And then the continuing education provider fees and the course applications would increase to cover the costs of providing those services. So are there questions from the board as it relates to the budget? I'm sure there are.
So if you can just start with the question that I posed earlier regarding how it translates, how we are monetizing some of these, or are we? And if we're not, can we or should we look at how monetizing the savings or the anticipated savings, or doing a study so that we can look and see what those savings are versus just having an arbitrary generalization of that will save us money. Well, how much? Because that can make a big difference on how we evaluate and look at future areas that we're going to need to improve upon in order for this not to continue to happen. Because one of the things that I've seen over the years is that we continuously get into the same situation, and we need to stop that. We really need to implement some specific plans and look at some specifics instead of generalizations.
Thank you for that. As far as the efficiencies to be gained through the use of the Connect system, at this point they are more theoretical, just due to the fact that the project remains under development. So we are dedicating a number of staff resources into developing the project with the future goal of achieving those efficiencies in the coming years. So we will be measuring the efficiencies gained, but at this point we're breaking even because we're getting the efficiencies in the process, but then we're having to dedicate additional staff resources through the development of the project. We are right now, we're finalizing the testing for the final project phase, and then we're going to move into the maintenance and operations phase where we can fine tune what's been developed and further realize those efficiencies. So we don't have it measured just yet. I will say that what we're expecting to gain from that is additional staff time and resources that, rather than being dedicated to opening the mail, cashiering checks, and dealing with the paper-based process, instead reducing the amount of time that staff is spending on kind of those more routine tasks and freeing up their time to be working towards the policy issues that are identified by the board's regulatory work, and everything that's going to come from the board through our next strategic plan. So I hope that's helpful and it addressed your question.
Thanks, Ms. Walker, but kind of answered the question, but still a couple of follow-ups. So do we have an anticipation of when the maintenance phase will begin and end? And I know that there's only projections until that happens, but we should, and this may be going into the weeds a bit, this is something that I would suggest putting on some agenda. I don't know if it's committee or what, but we should, once that phase is complete, look at finalizing or trying to put together some type of information that monetizes where our savings are, or where we are as far as our savings are concerned. So if now we no longer, we have staff that is spending half their day opening mails, et cetera, they no longer have to do that. What's the anticipated cost savings there with no longer having to do that at all, or no longer having to spend 8 hours a day on it for one staff. Now we can move that staff someplace else. So it's those type of questions that I'm suggesting that we look at. Not necessarily, I know we won't have an answer for this, but this is something that I'm suggesting that we put on an agenda so that we can really look at it. So again, that we don't end up in 3 years in this same predicament that we were in the last 6 years ago when I started on the board. Well, I started longer than that, but some time ago, it seems that we end up at the same juncture, and we just want to, make sure that we can do everything we can so that we don't have to.
Okay, thank you. As far as your first question, the maintenance and operations phase is scheduled to begin here in the spring. We're just closing out the final project phase, and then we're going to move into that. And it's anticipated to last between 12 to 18 months. I would offer as a suggestion that as far as really measuring the benefits to us from that project, I think that would be a great idea for the board to discuss during strategic planning. Include that as part of the strategic plan and formally study it. With the majority of the work being done by staff, but just to really keep it at the forefront so that we are measuring what comes of that project. And in terms of what we're anticipating is that we're going to get more value for the money that's being spent on our personnel. We're not, at this point, there's been no discussions of reducing our staff. We do have a very small staff of just 19 people, but we're going to get a lot more value with that staff if they're not spending half the day working on mail, and instead we can redirect them to the other important work that's being done by the board. And I hear you, and I agree with your thoughts on that it is something that needs to be closely monitored. We need to monetize it and really watch so that this doesn't occur again. So thank you.
No, thank you.
I see Ms. Cruz, please.
Hello, I have two items. Well, first, to build on Dr. McLean's comments, and I think you actually already touched on it a little bit, is really, it's likely going to happen when we get to the strategic planning phases of just being able to identify kind of the current anticipated hard and soft savings, given whether it be the constraints, the resources, direct, indirect costs that we're currently aware of. You mentioned earlier a list of items that were not taken into account in the most recent kind of fee analysis. I believe anticipation of the increased investigation workload, for example. So as it relates to that particularly, are there any plans to, let's say, make adjustments to the fee recommendation to account for kind of any additional items? I guess what I'm concerned about is, in the past, you had mentioned a number of key items were not taken into account. We had an analysis completed, knowing that we're in this very, I would say, interesting window where, fingers crossed, we're entering an endemic period with COVID-19. Is there any plans to kind of, whether it be soon or closer to the strategic planning session, to take a look at those needed adjustments?
I think what we have in place for the fee study puts us on solid ground for getting the board back into fiscal shape, but I would certainly welcome the board to discuss and consider tracking the budget formally through a strategic plan objective so that we're not only measuring our efficiencies, but anticipating things far in advance so that we don't, if we're starting to get ourselves in a situation, how do we get out of it and make incremental adjustments rather than having to do a full-scale realignment of all of our fees. As far as the two factors that weren't considered during the Matrix Consulting Group, one is an anticipated increase in expenditures for the Division of Investigation. We're hoping to offset those costs by efficiencies gained through our increased use of electronic means for conducting interviews, as well as the reclassification of staff, which would result in some cost savings on personnel costs. So we're hoping to keep that to break even, but we'll be closely monitoring those expenditures so that our enforcement line item doesn't increase out of line. And then the other one at this point is just proposed legislation that would reduce the inactive license fee. So that it's conceptual in phase, but if that were to go through, then we would have to make adjustments because the current fees are based on the fact that licensees, whether they're in an active or inactive status, are paying the same amount. So that's just something that we're watching that we need to be aware of, because if that was to go through, we're going to have to make a slight change.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board members? Okay, hearing and seeing no hands raised, we'll move on to issue number 5, fee increases and barriers to chiropractic professionals. The question was, with the need for statutory fee increases, has BCE considered how to minimize the impact of these fee increases on early career chiropractic professionals or on underrepresented chiropractic professionals? And I guess in our response and in our talking points that we generated, we note that the board has not formally studied the impacts of licensing fees on early career professionals or those from traditionally underrepresented groups. We felt like we would like to discuss this issue further at strategic planning activities. I will note one of the from the background paper, we noted that some of the references that were utilized weren't necessarily maybe Chiro specific or from kind of a known source, at least not to my eyes. So we plan to include the gender and ethnic diversity MBCE practice analysis from 2020, which does note some increases in gender and ethnicity diversity in the profession. And I think the other point that I want to make here is that we did the current fee study did show how some of the efficiencies that we gained in the initial license process and how those have led to reduced costs. So maybe to the previous point, we might be able to tie some of these in together. Anything else to add, Ms. Walker?
No, that's about it. There is a reference in the background paper to the board overcharging applicants for the initial fee, because I think it's incorrectly framed in that manner, because when we looked at the prior fee study, they looked at our process and they said, this is what it costs you to process these applications. And then now with the new study, I think some of those efficiencies that we've already gained through the Connect system show how we can pass the savings of about $75 off to initial applicants entering the profession, because the majority of them are now utilizing our new system to initiate that process.
And I would only add to that too. I think one of the key points in our response here is that we're really creating parity in the payment system and the costs of by the matrix fee study and actually reflecting our costs to for everything that we do on the board. And so I think we're pretty well justified in kind of the talking points and the potential responses that we're presenting so far. Is there any discussion from or questions from any of the board members?
Dr. Adams, just a comment. In reviewing this document, in consideration of how much chiropractic college has increased since I left chiropractic school, I find it almost surprising that they would be concerned about some of the fees that we're charging. They're very reasonable, in my opinion. And to say that or imply that we're somehow overcharging, our fees, we've talked about this, since I've been on the board just over a year now. These fees are in a lot of areas are grossly under what they could be. And obviously we can increase in certain areas and decrease in certain areas a little bit, but I think our fees are are more than appropriate, and actually, in my opinion, should be going up, which I think will help with our fiscal responsibilities.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, and we will note that, we consider the annual renewal fee increase of only $23 to be marginal. So I think we feel comfortable, or at least I feel comfortable with the study and knowing that that represents our costs, and that we do have some fees going down too. So that duly noted. I see Dr. McLean's hand up.
I have just kind of a general question. At the beginning of this document that you sent out, there's just a lot of introduction and description. There's a couple of questions in the language or how things are described. And I'm trying to go back really quickly and give you an example of what I was looking at. One of the things I'm looking at was on, I think it's page 9 of this document. I'm trying to go back. Where are we? 38. My computer is not cooperating. Give me 1 second. Where it's gone too far. Of course, I might not be, I'm not on the right page. Anyway, it's discussing the issues that were brought up by the fee analysis. It's that area in the initial part of this document that discusses that. And it mentions that the reason for the expenditures outpacing what we have was mainly due to the CE applications, but it didn't mention petitions and the imbalance there at all. And I'm wondering if that is something that we need to put in there as well, or if this portion is just for our benefit and for now, but is this portion going to the committee, and does the committee do we need to rectify that as well? As there's another part, but it comes with something that we're going to discuss later, so I'll be looking for that so I can specifically show you that. So do you understand my question?
I think I do. I think both I think both the continuing education costs and our actual workload costs were identified along with enforcement, and I think both of those are addressed or planned to be addressed in our issues. I think we get to some of that a little bit later here, but if not, maybe we can circle back. I'm not sure if I understood your question though. Is that?
Yes, it does. And I definitely want to circle back to the issues with, and I know that we are compelled or we are restricted to some degree, but definitely want to, again, maybe this is something to go on strategic plan or to be discussed by subcommittee. But again, we need to look at the inadequacy in costs expenditure that's created by the enforcement or lack thereof of the ability to collect from the petitioners. And I know that there's some language later on that we're going to discuss that to be added. But so along those lines, that we definitely make sure that we put that on the agenda to discuss.
And just to clarify then, are you referring to like a future committee meeting agenda, board agenda, or do you mean actually in our written response?
I mean, in the written response as well as, I don't know if it would behoove us to do it in the committee versus the board. That's really kind of up to you and staff at that point. But as we get to the enforcement part, let's just discuss it a little more when we get to the enforcement question, or if there's more on enforcement that we're going to be discussing.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I would say too that just remembering also that we also have this tremendous opportunity this year through strategic planning to really take a deeper dive into any of those specifics of some of these issues and address them as probably as thoroughly as we'll get an opportunity to. So, thank you. I see Mrs. Cruz. I see your hand there.
Yes, and I believe we're on 5 still, right?
Yes.
Making
Yes.
sure I'm looking at the right one.
Yes.
I know we haven't had much, there wasn't too much discussion on this particular topic. I feel like this can be an opportunity to bring it up in our committees in one of the committees of how we want to address it. I'm looking at here, it's one of the asks is to provide, it says to address mechanisms to reduce impact of licensing fees. And I think this section, the question at hand is not whether or not the fees are fair or not. And that it's not that. That's not the, at least in how I'm reading it, that is not the focus in the lens I'm looking at it. The lens I'm looking at it is kind of given some of the statistics in this section, what are some things the chiropractic community face in different segmentations of the chiropractic community. So wondered if this is something we can take on in one of the committees. Not sure which one, but is that an option, or is it more a strategic planning type thing?
I think anything that you want to put on a committee agenda is open for discussion. My understanding and kind of the talking points that we created here for the hearing and kind of what we're doing at the beginning prior to our discussion on each issue was really focused on answering the question asked of us in the issue. And in this case, I read that to say, has BCE, I read it very directly, has, identifying the need that we need statutory fee increases, and has BCE considered how to minimize the impact of these, on early chiropractic professionals or underrepresented chiropractic professionals. So I guess the strict answer that we had to that question was that we have not formally studied the impacts that has on early career professionals or underrepresented. And so it seemed like a topic that as we did the talking points, as we went through talking points here prior to the hearing, it seemed like a topic that really we had to sit down and get input from the board on how necessarily we might impact those. And are there other maybe stakeholders that are more appropriate from the consideration that we're only basing our fees on costs? We actually have some of our initial fees going down. So I think we've kind of satisfied that maybe unintentionally just through the fee study, and that our renewal fees are going up. So for those early career, year 2, year 3, our renewal fees are going up only marginally, $23. So I think that's how we looked at it. But I think anything that comes up out of this meeting can surely, if it's a topic that needs to go to a committee, surely we're going to have this discussion during strategic planning too.
Fair. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. McLean, I see your hand is up. Was that the previous, or go ahead?
No, just to go a little further with Mrs. Cruz's question. I agree with the interpretation there, but also the answer that you've given on a couple of occasions here to some of this information is that we've not formally studied that. Do we plan to put that all of all of that in the strategic plan on those things that we've not formally studied to really take a look at that so that we can gather the important data that needs to be collected.
I believe so. I think there's, I think the question to us, and this is our strategic planning committee's, meeting and strategic planning session. So this is everybody's input, but my impression is that we would maybe not necessarily endeavor to study the issue, but more discuss it at strategic planning, and then decide if we just need to have the discussion around the issue, and if somehow out of that we decide to formally study it, then we would have to take that into consideration too, as far as, what does that mean, and are there costs associated, and what type of data are we truly seeking. So I think it probably is two separate discussions, but I think at the very least, having the issue brought up at our strategic planning so that we can have the discussion as to how we may or may not be able to address this, which may include a formal study, but it may mean just a study of, well, I hate to say study from the purest definition, but having, all the leadership and the board members kind of, come up with some ideas on the impacts there and how we might be able to affect those.
When we're speaking of question number 5, I think that would be very beneficial for us to at least put that on the plan for strategic plan, to look at best practices of how to evaluate that, which should include specifically when we're discussing underrepresented groups, that we look at those organizations that represent those underrepresented groups as stakeholders and in the conversation.
Agreed. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any other board questions, comments, discussion on issue number 5? Dr. McLean, did you have another question or discussion on number 5? I see your hand up. Maybe it just got left up.
I had a second. Put my hand down.
It's coming up right now. Okay. So let's move on to issue number 6, and that is reciprocal license requirements. And I'll read the question. BCE requires applicants that hold active licenses from other states and are seeking license reciprocity in California to have completed training and evaluation equivalent to California requirements. How do California licensing requirements compare to other states? Has the BCE considered revising license reciprocity requirements for candidates holding chiropractic licenses in other states, or allow reciprocity with candidates who are licensed in other countries? And our prepared talking points for the hearing were that, we wanted to note that to be eligible for licensure by reciprocity, the applicants, essentially the processes are very similar, the initial application process and reciprocity, and that, you have to graduate from a board-approved chiropractic college. There was equivalent successful examination in each of the subjects examined in California. In the same year the applicant was issued their license in another state. For reciprocity, you have to hold a valid license in the state from which you are reciprocating, and that state must provide reciprocity to California licensees. You have to pass the California chiropractic law examination, and the last qualifier was that they have 5 years of practice, and that otherwise applicants can apply and must apply through the initial application process if they didn't meet all those. And I think one point that we wanted to address in responding to this was that the processes requirements are similar. The reciprocity paths allow for licensure under prior formats of the MBCE exam, and we were hoping to continue further discussion of this at the strategic planning sessions, mainly around maybe re-examining the need for 5 years in practice, and whether or not it's necessary to have a state that provides reciprocity to California licensees, whether that should matter or not in our decision to allow it. Ms. Walker, was there anything else there?
No, that was the main issue. As far as there's the two paths to licensure for someone that's already licensed in another state. They can get in through reciprocity, or they can also go through the initial application process. But it's something that we felt that maybe the board would want to consider discussing during strategic plan if you wanted to look at those barriers to licensure and from people coming from another state, and see if any changes would be appropriate.
And so, yeah, we were hoping to have that on our strategic planning agenda. And are there any discussion questions from members of the board?
Dr. Adams, I concur, and I think we should move to the strategic plan and move to the next item.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion from the board members? Okay, hearing none and seeing no hands raised, let me double check. Let's move on to issue number 7, continuing education. What accountability metrics are in place to ensure CE earned through distance learning is appropriate? Are licensees complying with CE requirements as demonstrated in ongoing audits BCE staff conducts to determine CE was actually completed? And our main talking points here with primarily number 1 is that in response to the upcoming expiration of CE waivers, that we've moved forward with a smaller regulatory package to narrow the definition of distance learning to asynchronous coursework, and that this will allow licensees to complete their coursework either in person via live interactive video conferencing platforms, with the exception, of course, of adjustive technique courses. And that same proposal would also grant us authority to allow exemptions to the CE requirements in cases where licensees have been affected by an emergency, a state of emergency, pandemic, wildfire, et cetera. And that's something we will consider at our next board meeting. We noted in our talking points here that the board holds continuing education providers accountable for their courses through audits of course content and attendance records. It was noted that our failed audit percentage was 15.4%, which was an increase and higher than comparable professions, MDs, DOs, PTs. And one of our points was also to note that this failure rate is expected to decrease over time with licensee outreach, regular auditing, and primary source verification. So their CE is completed at the time of renewal. And Ms. Walker, anything else there?
I would just add that staff is going to be, because this issue also came up during the hearing about the high non-compliance rate with the board's CE audits. There are a few issues worth or notes worth making on that issue. One of them is that in the prior sunset review, one of the issues that came up was the board wasn't conducting audits. So we aggressively ramped up and started auditing 10%, just under 10% of the renewals that we were receiving. And in turn, we did see a high failure rate for those audits. I would like to note that the majority of those, it's not that licensees are just simply not taking their CE. It comes down to, one or two issues, whether they missed the ethics and law requirement, maybe they were short just a few hours. So we do want to provide a little bit more context in light of just kind of the data and the committee's concerns. Because while there were failed audits, we don't have 15% of licensees just flat out not taking CE. So we do want to note that in the response. And then as Dr. Paris noted, as part of this IT project, we are working on getting primary source verification directly from our CE providers with an ultimate goal of 100% compliance at the time of renewal, thereby eliminating the need for audits.
Are there any, Dr. McLean, I see your hand up.
Hi. Yes, I have a couple of questions. And so, Ms. Walker, is that the reason that that we have suggested that the target for audit rates be reduced to 5% instead of the original 10%, because that seems to me a little too low, because just safety wise, and while I understand that people are not failing in this area because of for the most part because of egregious issues, but just sometimes clerical things, I still think that it's very important that we maintain auditing and maintain keeping track of what's going on as far as continuing ed is concerned, because it is so important. So that's my first question. Then I have a follow-up if you want to talk about that or answer that first.
I can answer your first question. So from a staffing perspective, we found that trying to hit that target of 10% was very difficult just due to the paper-based process that we have in place. We can work with our IT folks to see if there's a more efficient way to maybe automatically somehow analyze the data that's submitted to where we can keep hitting that percentage. And then if the board isn't comfortable with us reducing that to 5%, we can continue with the 10%. It may just increase the amount of time it takes for us to review those audit results when we get them in. But certainly we don't have to reduce that if the board would like to continue at 10% audits.
I'm hoping that we can get an answer from IT, because given that we're spending all this money for this IT system, that's definitely one area that an efficient IT system and tracking and having it automated would be very beneficial. If that's not currently something that was planned, that's something to have a discussion about maybe as we're going through these next phases in the IT system. The other question or comment that I had, again, goes back to in the original information given out. I think that there's kind of an error. There is an error in language of how under the background information. If we go to page 16, where it's talking about the continuing ed and the fee waivers, in the second paragraph it says, however, due to COVID-19, the DCA recently approved a request to extend a waiver of this 12-hour cap through distance learning through March. It is my understanding of my interactions with staff and with DCA that the extension wasn't due to a request, but DCA extended that based on the current situations and recommendations in public health and the public health perspective, not just for this board, but for another board as well. So I wanted to get some clarification, because here it says one thing and then later on it says just that DCA implemented the waiver.
You are correct. When we submitted the sunset review report, at that time, the waiver actually expired at the end of last year. And then this background papers prepared by committee staff based on kind of their understanding of the issues and what they're seeing as far as the waivers. So that just as a point of clarification, that waiver was extended by the administration based on concerns about the Omicron variant, not a specific request that was made.
Sorry, I was muted. Right, that was my my point. So we need to be careful with language and make sure that we correct that before moving forward with putting these documents out for public consumption, or even for our next meeting or the board subcommittee meeting. That's a suggestion that I'd like to make here.
Certainly, yeah, that will be reflected in our response. Thank you.
And then I had one other question. And I'm kind of going back just a little bit because I saw a note that I had that I missed. When we talked about, we were speaking about audits, looking at the huge jump in failed audits in 19 and 20. We suspended them in 2021, appropriately so, but in 19 and 20, there was a huge increase in failed audits. And do we know why that was, or did we look at why that was? And I know that it's hard looking at data for these last fiscal years and comparing what's happening, because we're in such a time that everything is off and unpredictable, but that jump was double what it was the previous years. And so just curious.
We actually spent some time pre-hearing, kind of preparing to have to discuss that. And I think you're referring to the 10.8% to the 23.5%.
Yes, I am.
In the year to year. One of the things that on looking further into that was that 2019-2020 was fiscal, so that went over into there was an overlap into COVID, and so that was the other than not really being able to really study it necessarily, but at least at this stage, it can be something we could discuss at strategic planning if we think it's an issue. One of the things that I noted though was that I think we calculated, Kristen, that included Ms. Walker. I'm sorry, 5 months of COVID. Was it March through June or something? February through June, late February. So that was the only, Dr. McLean, that was the only thing that I was really able to identify that, might have, there were no executive orders or no waivers in place. It was early COVID, and I think people just were panicking, quite frankly, with the COVID pandemic early on.
So just like other things that we've discussed previously, may I suggest that as a part of the strategic plan that we look at where we are, where our numbers are currently, to see if we're on a current trajectory to have it be similar in that increased amount, or if we're back to the standards of in the 10, 11, 12 percentile. And just to again make sure that we are following up and looking at things before they become problematic.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. We will probably have a small sample size, maybe not a full year, but we were gonna, we'll have 5 months before of potential audit data, I believe. So yeah, I think we could bring that in and at least take a look at that and discuss it at the strategic planning session, get a glimpse at if that appears to be, something that's hung around beyond the initial COVID time period. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the board members? Hearing none, seeing none. Dr. McLean, I see your hand up. Is that on number 7 still?
I'm sorry, I always forget to let it.
That's okay.
Lowering it.
Okay, so moving on to issue number 8, performance-based assessment of licensee competency. And the issue question was, has the board considered adding performance-based assessment of licensee competency in addition to or in lieu of CE coursework. And in our prepared talking points, discussion points, we responded that the board has not discussed this issue, and it would likely be referred for consideration during our strategic planning meeting. We did note that as part of the CE enhancements, the Licensing and Continuing Education Committee has discussed requiring knowledge checks, examinations, course evaluations as part of the comprehensive updates. And we also were prepared to note that concerns regarding licensees' competency are often brought to the board's attention through enforcement cases, and we noted again that our commitment to consumer safety, and that we order ethics and boundaries assessments, post-licensure examinations, mental and physical examinations in any cases where there's questions of a licensee's continued fitness to practice is an issue. And I think that's all I have. Ms. Walker, was there anything to add to that response?
No, not on this one. We did indicate in the Sunset report that the board hadn't studied any performance-based assessments. So in my opinion, I think it's appropriate that it be referred over for strategic planning for the board to discuss it.
Are there any questions or discussion from the board members on number 8? Hearing none, seeing no hands raised. Let me move, Ms. Walker, number 9, please.
Thank you. So issue number 9 relates to enforcement timeframes. Since the last Sunset review, the BCE has reduced the time required to complete formal discipline, but it still has not been able to meet the target timeframe set by the BCE and DCA. Has the board considered implementing additional measures to reduce enforcement timeframes? And this is primarily an internal issue. The answer is certainly yes. The board is committed, as you know, to protecting consumers through its enforcement program. The board did set what I would say is an aggressive goal of closing investigations within 120 days, especially compared to some of the timeframes that other boards and bureaus within DCA have set. However, through technology training and as well as our reorganization, we do hope to achieve that in the coming years. As far as the broad kind of reorganization of the BCE staff that I was previously discussing, we're actually looking to reorganize and separate the duties of the analysts within our unit. Currently, they handle everything from receipt of the initial complaint all the way through the disciplinary process, and we believe that there's some efficiencies to be gained if we can designate some staff to solely perform the desk investigative work, and then have other staff focused on case review and case management to just further achieve some efficiencies. Also, as of November, we transitioned all of our enforcement processes to the new Connect system. And as of last July, consumers can file complaints directly with us online. So all of that has been helping to drive down our enforcement timeframes. We're also, through the pandemic and the increased use of video conferencing, we've been able to leverage some of that technology in our investigations. And so rather than traveling to participate in interviews, we can set them up in a platform similar as what we're doing today to not only reduce timeframes, but also reduce costs. As of last year, as of the beginning of this year, we added clerical support to our enforcement unit as well, so that to further kind of get the analysts to have more specialized work and that they're not trying to juggle too many things. We've been focusing on training staff to perform thorough and comprehensive investigations, which has driven up some of our timeframes. But we expect that, once they're fully kind of trained and used to new processes, that those timeframes will go down. And we're also really interested in using the Connect system to provide us with better and more comprehensive data regarding our enforcement processes. As we noted in the Sunset report, some aging is outside of the board's control. when we wait for cases, when we're notified of an arrest and we have to monitor it and wait for it to become a conviction, that's all counting against us. And that process can sometimes take well over a year. And then there's other cases where it comes directly to us as a consumer complaint. And we're responsible for those timeframes. So we want to use the data that we're getting through the Connect system to better differentiate between those two paths so that we can continue to work on efficiencies in our process through kind of a data-driven approach to enforcement, developing better reporting tools, as well as a method for us to tag cases by emerging and trending issues, and provide just more comprehensive data, which I know has come up frequently by the board members, and it's something that you are seeking from us. I also want to note that we don't currently have vacancies in the enforcement unit, but just due to vacancies in other units, some of our enforcement staff has had to, at times, assist with our other functions. So are there any questions from the board members as it relates to enforcement and our timeframes?
This is not necessarily a time frame, but it is an enforcement question. Back to what we were discussing regarding costs and the table on page 30, the amount collected in enforcement. Looking at the data from 2021 to previous data and the current versus the previous data and the amounts collected, that seems very problematic. And so just as a point of attention, or that we should place in our planning process or further look at in some capacity, is as we look at our strategic plan and we look at the language and the additions that you've made to the language regarding what can be collected, and that we really evaluate how we can improve collections from petitioners as well. If there's a way of changing that language, I know it can be a regulatory issue. So wherever it may be appropriate, we need to really evaluate that, because if we look at, I think it was 2021, if we looked at the amount collected was less than 40% of what was owed to us. It seems very disheartening that we are having such a fund issue, and yet this is not an area that we can increase our collecting power. It seems very imbalanced.
Okay, I see your point on that. I think as part of so the board's enforcement committee is working on updates to the board's disciplinary guidelines, and one of the key factors or the issues with collecting cost recovery happens to be that on a number of cases, whether we're revoking a license or if someone's surrendering their license, oftentimes their cost recovery isn't actually due until the point of them petitioning the board for reinstatement of their license. So it creates an amount that's owed to the board, but really isn't quite collectible until sometime possibly in the future if they come and seek licensure again. I think, if that's a concern, the enforcement committee should discuss taking a look at the model language that's within the disciplinary guidelines and maybe addressing it to change, whether even if you surrender a license, your cost is still owed within a set time frame rather than upon petitioning the board for reinstatement. That would just be one suggestion with that issue.
And that's a suggestion that's been previously made, that we make it within a specific time frame. But certainly one of the issues that I've witnessed and we've seen over the years is that at the very minimum, even though the language says that they need to pay it before it's reinstated, it's almost never paid when the petitioners come before. So at the very minimum, changing the language so that they have to pay that before even taking up more of our time and costing us more money of coming before us in a petition hearing.
Certainly, and that's another issue that the enforcement committee is looking at is the as part of the CPEI regulations is the petition process. So if the board wanted to put that in place, that would certainly be appropriate for the regulation that as a condition precedent to even being heard by the board, that cost recovery must be paid in full.
So as the head of the enforcement committee, Dr. Paris, I'm just relaying that to you to make sure to have that discussion or put that on your agenda, please.
Will do. Thank you. I think that's good direction for staff as we develop, our response to this issue. The one thing I would add is I really believe that, the fact that we're not currently capturing, the arrest to conviction time and kind of adjusting for that. And if that can be built in to connect, I think we're going to see a drastic shift here on our time frames. And then I hope that if staff could potentially work on language that at least identifies the essence that we boards set their own timeframes and in the interest of public protection, we've set a pretty ambitious goal here, a pretty ambitious cycle time with the 120 days for our disciplinary action for the investigation. So if we could frame that somehow, to note that we plan on meeting that. So we set an ambitious goal and we plan on meeting it. So I see Dr. McLean's hand up.
I'm going to let it down before I start talking so I don't forget. So yes, along that line, Dr. Paris, you suggest that the goal is ambitious, but my question is, what are the time frame of other boards? Ms. Walker mentioned that you looked at other boards. What are other healing arts boards? What are their time frames so that we can gauge where we are in the pendulum there?
I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me, but we did look at a department-wide what the different goals were, and they ranged anywhere between 90 up to, I believe one board even had a year, but more commonly it was between 180 to 270 days seemed to be the most common one that we saw. So we were slightly below that with a goal of closing these in 4 months. And like we noted, that's a goal that we want to meet. We're not trying to adjust that or increase it. We need to figure out how we're going to effectively meet that. And I think a lot of the efficiencies to be gained through the use of like Teams for conducting the interviews and just working with staff to make sure that we're making kind of immediate progress at each stage. We'll get there. And we'll certainly put the comparison in our response.
And as a follow-up, along the same lines, the goal for the target cycle for discipline from start to finish was, I believe, 540 days, and we are nowhere near that. We are upwards of 800 or 900. Where does that fall into the average for other DCA boards as well?
So the 540 days, about 18 months, that's the departmental standard. So that's a consistent standard across the board. I think with us building in 120 days for our investigation, then the 540-day target is pretty achievable because that allows for over a year for us to finish the disciplinary process. One of the challenges that we've had when looking at the data that we currently do have is that oftentimes we have the case for a year or longer before it goes over to the Attorney General's office. So while that total time frame is quite lengthy, I certainly wouldn't put the fault on the Attorney General's office because they do have their process, and that usually can take about a year. So we need to effectively work on our internal investigation process to get that number down and then get ourselves within both targets.
So I understand that the 540 days is the standard, but where do other boards, what's the average that you're seeing from other boards? And if you don't have that information right now, if you can get that back to us. What are you seeing? I know we have our numbers, which are, like you said, we know there's a lot of variables involved there, but that gives us an idea. How far off the mark are we, and are we an island to ourselves, or as far as being that far off the mark?
I don't have the data right in front of me. I was trying to pull it up, but my computer's going a little bit slow today. As far as there's quite the variance within the department, and we'll look at the boards that are most comparable to us. I'll say that we're not alone in the situation, but there are boards that are achieving their targets. So, you know, we'll put some more detailed data in the written response, but that is actually quite a varying item, just depending on the different boards that you're looking at.
I'm certain, and I know that, you know, we don't want to compare apples and oranges, but at least that gives us some general ideas, as well as for those boards who are meeting their goals, who that given that they might be, or the boards that you're looking at that are comparable, as close to us as possible. If any of those are meeting their goals, let's look at how they're meeting those goals to see if we can glean some insight into other areas that we can improve and model that behavior.
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, discussion from the board members? That was issue number 9. Not seeing any hands raised and hearing none. Let's move on to issue 10, practice violations. And the question was, has the board sought additional enforcement measures to curb the spread of medical misinformation within the chiropractic community? And our in our talking points and in our response, we reiterated initially that, you know, the board's mission to protect the health, welfare, and safety of the public through licensure, education, and enforcement, and that we were committed to consumer protection. You know, I noted that we shared frustrations in seeing the spread of health misinformation, and then we detailed that we had received several complaints regarding advertising or inferring that chiropractic care can help patients reduce their risk of COVID infection. And we also noted that we initially took an educational approach by notifying licensees of the complaint, reviewing their response, and closing cases after they removed any questionable or unsupported claims. We noted that we were proactive in, you know, meeting with stakeholders and reminding them, or utilizing our website and reminding stakeholders that the expectation was to align with public health mandates or recommendations. I think also in our response, we were prepared to update and, you know, kind of define our approach and the process to this issue. Ms. Walker, anything else there?
No, I would just say that from the staff perspective, due to some kind of limitations with our systems, we're still gathering the numbers so that we can provide some more detailed data back to the committees in the written response. As Dr. Paris had outlined, we initially were taking an educational approach by notifying licensees of the complaint, requesting their response, and then just, you know, educating them on the matter. We do have some egregious cases that remain under investigation that we can't comment too much on, but we are going to get a little bit more detailed information in the written response back to the committee.
Are there any questions or discussion from the board members on issue 10? Not seeing any raised hands and hearing none, I'll move us to issue number 11, enforcement disclosures. The Patient's Right to Know Act requires BCE licensees to disclose probationary status to patients. The BCE recommended in their report that 2 exemptions be removed from this act, Business and Professions Code 1007, Subdivision C, to strengthen consumer protection. Are there any additional members that can be taken to ensure consumers are aware of the probationary status of licensees? And in our talking points in response, first of all, I think we noted that, we felt like it was in the best interest of consumer protection to remove the exemptions that could allow, from a chiropractic context, patients to not be informed. And so I think we all remember that discussion. And so that was noted. And otherwise, Ms. Walker, did you want to add to that?
Well, as far as the staff recommendation and the point that we need to respond to is providing information on the impacts of amending the Patient's Right to Know Act to remove these exemptions. Certainly, my opinion, and I think the reflection from the board's discussion on the matter is that it would certainly benefit patients by just kind of eliminating some inadvertent exemptions to the requirement that could allow kind of crafty probationers to find ways to get around notifying their patients of their probationary status. One item that we did note is that the board's enforcement staff, we conduct detailed intake interview sessions with each new probationer to ensure they understand and comply with the terms and conditions of probation. And board staff has plainly observed that since this notification requirement became effective, we're consistently receiving questions from probationers with questions relating to these different exemptions, specifically for unscheduled visits and when the licensee is not known to the patient until immediately prior to the start of the visit, which we're presuming is in some sort of an attempt to find an avenue to circumvent this very important patient notification requirement. And that's the primary driver here is we want to ensure that, patients know that, the licensee that they're treating with is on probation, that they're given the information that they need, and then they can make a decision. So consistent with the board's consumer protection mandate, the purpose here is to clarify the requirement so that patients do know that the licensee treating them has been disciplined by the board, except for just in rare emergency situations where there's no time for that notification to be made.
Any questions or discussion from the board members? Seeing no hands raised and hearing none, I do have a question, just a clarification, I think. In our response, the question directly says, are there any additional measures that can be taken to ensure consumers are aware of the probationary status of licensees? Is our response going to reflect that we feel like removing the 2 exemptions are sufficient, and that our answer would be no, that we don't have any further suggestions or additional measures that we'd consider taking?
I would probably want to offer in that point that this information is available to consumers through DCA search, but it remains kind of a challenge ensuring that patients are aware of who we are and they know to look. So we can certainly benefit from an additional outreach, just really making sure that patients know who the board is, how you can look up a person's background and understand the information that they do see on that DCA search website. So I think there are some efforts that I think can either be done by staff or overseen by one of the board's committees to really help us kind of just increase public awareness of the board, our enforcement program, and the DCA search capabilities.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion or questions from the board members? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to issue number 12, impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since March 2020, there have been a number of waivers issued through executive orders that impact BCE operations, BCE licensees, providers, and patients throughout the state. Do any of these waivers warrant an extension or statutory changes? How has the BCE addressed issues resulting from the pandemic, and how does the board aim to continue to address these issues as the pandemic endures? And I'll let Ms. Walker lead off here.
Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button. So as far as so this issue, it kind of contains some external kind of profession issues as well as board operations. So in light of the pandemic, the board's management, continues to support telework for employees. But we do note that our current fund condition has prevented the board from purchasing necessary equipment and software such as laptops and additional monitors to really allow staff to effectively work from home on more of a full-time basis. We also still heavily rely on paper-based processes. So as a result, we really can only support up to 2 days a week for remote staff. As far as improvements that were made at the board, we did recently upgrade both of our phone and fax services to allow staff to utilize those services both at home and in the office. And we continue to effectively serve all licensees, applicants, and the public. When it comes to some of the external kind of profession issues, one spot that we do need some direction from the board on relates to the issue of telehealth. The board hasn't specifically addressed or discussed it in the past. And I will say from the staff perspective, we're not seeing, as we've gone through the pandemic, we've had a few complaints related to care that was delivered through telehealth, but we were able to effectively use our existing enforcement process and our expert review process to address those issues. But that's one thing that I think is worth the board considering is, in response to their question, if there's a need for further regulation of telehealth in the chiropractic community.
And I believe we had prepared as a talking point, I don't know if it was stated at the hearing, but that we were planning to discuss this further during strategic planning, this broad issue. The telehealth issue, I should say. Are there any questions or discussion from the board members on this? Seeing no hands raised, hearing none, let's move on to issue number 13. Technical changes may improve effectiveness of BCE operations. There are amendments to BCE's Practice Act that are technical in nature, but may improve BCE operations and the enforcement of the Act. And our prepared talking points response was that the board has not yet discussed any changes to the Chiropractic Initiative Act. And I don't believe we expounded on that any further, Ms. Walker.
No, we hadn't. In the background paper, they're talking about making technical changes, but with the uniqueness of the board's act not being in the Business and Professions Code and instead being an initiative act, there's quite a few nuances to going through that process. This is another issue where a little bit of direction from the board would be helpful, whether we're just in response going to say that, at this time we don't believe there's any technical changes needed to the act, or if this is something that the board wants to discuss further during strategic planning, we could steer it in that direction as well.
Are there any thoughts from or discussion from the board members on that issue? Is this something we'd like to respond and put into our strategic planning sessions? Dr. McLean, I see your hand up.
I would suggest that this be a topic that we discuss in strategic plan.
This is Dr. Adams. I concur.
Thank you. Any other discussion or questions on issue number 13? Okay. Seeing no hands raised, I would only add that I also would support that we at least lay out the challenges and the issues and have this in front of us in strategic planning and make a decision if we are going to move forward and how, discussions of how. Issue number 14, regulatory review of the regulatory functions of the BCE, and we thank them. We thank the committee for the review, and our recommendation, our talk was that the BCE should be reviewed again on a future date to be determined. So that's an easy one. If there's any discussion points or questions, thoughts on that from the board. Hearing none. Ms. Walker, were there a few specific questions also that we wanted to put out for possible discussion?
Just one moment. I'm just navigating to the background information.
Yeah.
We've covered all of the issues that were addressed in the background paper, and some of the issues that came up during the hearing are closely intertwined with our response in the background paper or to those issues. So I'm just double checking here. I think we have what we need. One of the issues that came up during the hearing had to do with the board's outstanding loan to the Bureau of Automotive Repair, which was based on a judgment against the board with an employee issue, and then whether licensees should be responsible for repayment of that loan. As a special fund, all of our money does come directly from the licensees or applicants or others that we're providing services to. So as long as the board's in concurrence, I mean, certainly we recognize that challenge and kind of the inequity of having to cover the administrative costs for the profession that you're regulating. But that's the current structure. And I'm assuming the board, if there was some kind of opportunity for funding from another avenue, the board would be supportive of that. And we could put that in the response. I just wanted to confirm that's the direction that the board would like to go.
That would meet with my approval. Anyone else? Any other board members?
I think that would suffice as well.
I concur.
Any other? Sorry, please go ahead.
And just looking through those issues, I think the only other one that was brought up at the hearing that we haven't discussed was whether there's controls in place for the board to limit legal expenses on our disciplinary cases, just in light of the huge expense that we incur through the Attorney General's office. In our response, I just wanted to note that of the cases that we do have, only 14% go to hearing. We do settle the majority of our cases, and some result in default decisions. So while we don't have formal controls in place, we do spend those dollars wisely, and then we also work closely with the assigned DAG for each case, and we generally take their advice on determining whether settlement is appropriate or whether we should be going forward with revocation. And in many cases, we'll take the hard stance when we have to, and those result in a licensee stipulating to surrender their license. So that's just the one other issue that we haven't discussed today, but I wanted to point out to the board members.
Dr. McLean, I see your hand up.
And Ms. Walker, by the same token, that increase in fee from the AG's office, regarding our legal increase in fee, again, just reiterates, and I know that I'm beating a dead horse, but reiterates why we really need to collect from the petitioners, because again, that's costing us even more now.
Understood. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. McLean. I think our full response will surely kind of reflect the themes that we're seeing across a number of these issues here. Thank you. Okay, we made it. Is there any other discussion from the board members or questions on any of those issues? I think we've given the board staff a lot of information and to work with in helping us develop our response. Is there anything else from the board members before we open it up for public comment?
Just wanted to ask regarding time-wise, now that we've done this, I know that staff is going to go back and prepare some changes in language. And will we have an opportunity to review this before the actual hearing takes place again? Or will that just be for the persons going to defend it?
And I believe our what we would like to get today is a motion to nominate, assign 2 board members to work with staff to come up with the final language. Does that sound correct, Ms. Walker?
Yes, the staff recommendation is for the board to designate 2 members to review and approve the final written response to the issues identified through Sunset Review on behalf of the board.
Are there any other questions or discussion points from any members of the board? Moderator, can we please open agenda item 2 for public comment?
Absolutely. We are now taking public comment on agenda item 2. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will take requests for comment in the order that they are received. As a reminder, we have a 3-minute time limit, and we will give you, I believe, a 15-second warning. Let's take a few seconds now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no requests for public comment, would you like to close comments at this time?
Please, thank you. And so is there a motion from the board?
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Ms. Cruz for the committee that's referenced here.
And Dr. McLean, do you have a second board member you would like to nominate? Sorry, Dr. McLean. Excuse me.
Sorry, I couldn't get to the button. Sorry. I'd also like to nominate Dr. Paris.
Okay, so we have a motion by Dr. McLean. Do we have a second?
This is Raphael Sweet. I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Any discussion? I do not see any hands raised or hearing no discussion. Mr. Sweet, can you please call for the vote?
Yes. David Paris,
Yes.
Lawrence Adams,
Yes.
Raphael Sweet, yes. Janet Cruz,
Yes.
Dion McLean.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Hurtado. Moving on to agenda item number 3, public comment for items not on the agenda. Moderator, can we please open for public comment for items not on the agenda? Agenda item number 3. Moderator, I don't see any.
Is the moderator still with us?
I see the slide that we're open for public comment. I don't hear the moderator on my end.
Hi, this is Trisha with Solid Planning. I jumped in on behalf of the moderator. I believe he lost internet connection. So were you in the midst of taking public comment?
Yes, we were.
Okay. All right. Let me check the attendee list. And it looks like, hold on just a moment. All right, so I have the Q&A panel open. If any member of the public would like to use that, or they may raise their hand. We'll give it just a moment. All right, I'm not seeing any raised hands or anyone typing that they want to make a comment in the Q&A panel. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Moving to agenda item number 4, future agenda items. Are there any future agenda items from members of the board? Seeing no hands raised, hearing none. Moderator, can we please open agenda item number 4, future agenda items for public comment?
Of course.
Thank you.
All right, the Q&A panel is now available. If any member of the public would like to make a comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists, or you may simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I'm not seeing any raised hands or any comments. Oh, I spoke too soon. We have Victor Tom that would like to make a comment. So Victor, you should now be able to unmute yourself. All right, you're unmuted.
There will be future discussion on the telehealth about the change of the regulation of allowing the webinar as live credit. I mean, those have been mentioned in the past board meeting at least several months, and they were kind of brought up by many, I guess, stakeholders and public comments. It was also discussed in the last meeting, but I don't see that in discussion or mention, or is there any plan in moving forward with that? The last I heard was that the CE committee was to try to work on the verbiage on allowing the distant learning to be included, to include the webinar or the interactive webinar. But I don't know what is happening, or would there be future agenda to follow this up? That's my comment and question.
All right, this is the moderator. I see no further requests for comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Hurtado, can we respond to that on this call?
No, Dr. Paris.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't think so.
The board can consider placing the telehealth issue on a future agenda item.
Okay. Mr. Tong, we will consider that. Thank you very much. Moving to agenda item number 5. I don't know that I need a motion, but I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Dr. Paris, you can simply adjourn the meeting as the chair.
Thank you. Time is 1:52 p.m. and this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all very much for attending.